So I'm going to start with all the way back to 250 AD, and it starts, surprisingly, not surprisingly, with colonialism. Immigration and colonialism have a huge link, and we'll kind of explore that more when we go to the presentation. For example, the Romans, they immigrated into England, and they specifically used black people to stand guard on Hadrian's Wall. So then again, we see how the use of black bodies is pushed into England, and therefore immigration is born. And each group brought a different culture, yes, you could argue, and there's a very, very early start of immigration. So we move to the 1500s now, and again, the key driver here is slavery and colonialism, and we start to see black faces begin to move into certain parts of society. So for example, we see that Henry VIII had a black trumpet player as entertainment for him, and we see how immigration, once again, has brought new culture, apparent culture. And the slave trade too is a huge source of immigration, and the arrival on plantation meant that cheap labour was required, and therefore the British began to buy into the slave trade and force people to immigrate into Britain. However, there was huge problems with this, and the biggest one was legal status. Because this was seen as like an economically driven thing, these people that immigrated into the UK, they had no legal status, and that's something you can still see with immigration today, the idea of having no status and no freedom, and you're just in limbo. So here we are in 1500s, 1700s. So by 1713 and 1722, England began to have more access to what we can call the New World. Merchants began to expand the slave trade, which I misspelled, and this increased the amount of immigrants. By 1770, 14,000 black people were in the UK, but once again, they had no real freedom. They were purely on economic terms, because as the New World expanded, they needed to grab more economic power. And we can really see how vital the economy is in the history of immigration. It's always justified in economic terms and economic values. And we start to see the beginning of the abolition movement as well, and how this links to the economy. And whilst the abolition movement began, there are always reasons for not using that movement to fully break down slavery, was once again economic. So by the 1800s, the end of slavery it was finally, apparently, if you look at legislation, it was apparently the end of slavery, which of course has a huge tie to immigration. In 1807, Parliament banned the trade, but not the actual act of enslavement. So what this actually meant was, whilst you could have slaves, you couldn't bring them over. So what was the solution? People used to just throw their captives overboard, which was completely shocking. And by 1833, Parliament apparently banned slavery across the entire British Empire. We know that's not true. India still continued to have slaves. And the wealthy families and certain companies, they were still allowed to use immigrants for economic power and economic value. So we can see how, despite legislation and immigration have a very tense relationship with one another. And the people that moved into these areas, there was a kind of idea of putting down your roots. If you're taken away from your country, you start to build your own self-communities, and you want to create a form of self-pride. So we start to see what kind of dichotomy between, here we are, we're liberal, and we're going to ban slavery, but we're going to still allow it to operate in certain areas and through certain clauses. And I think you can really see that with the first non-white MP, who was also very good friends with the founder of Pakistan. So, well, we should be happy. He was the so the first non-white MP can show, look, we can take immigrants, but we'll put them on the highest value of an MP, and therefore we are liberal, and therefore we accept immigration. We can see that's not really the case by looking at the real kind of inner workings of that legislation. So by 1940 and 1945, the biggest presence in immigration was 2 world wars. there was a huge amount of labour shortage, which meant that the empire had to get labour power from somewhere, and they began to look towards apparently the Asian subcontinent. So thousands of men from empire, they moved into the First World War, they fought for the British. There was 1.3 million Indian people who fought for the British, and 138,000 of them served on the Western Front. There was no clear rules on immigration, but there was again once seen as like, you do this for us because you are under our power and we want to extract your value. And a huge amount of British seamen in particular came from India, and 60,000 of them moved into the UK. And we start to see a tension now of them rebuilding the country with black and Asian people, but there was still a fear of black faces in a white Britain. And Britain was still white by this point. So I really wanted to focus in particular the huge amount of racial prejudice that these people faced. They were not only forced to move over here through the British Raj, all these clauses. So there's the Alaska agreements, which meant they had to move to the UK, and they had to fight, and they had to always stay in the country too. So these were called the LASCARS, and they had a huge amount of racial prejudice against them. They were employed on European ships, and the British East India Company were the people that basically pulled them over. And what was amazing about these people was that the amount of self-pride that they had. No matter any history of immigration, you will always see a form of self-pride, even in the face of racial prejudice that these people faced. Like, you can see they're wearing their traditional clothing because they didn't want to give that up, which is amazing. And also there was the rise in interracial relationships at this time. So a lot of these Alaska seamen, they would often marry white women, and they would have children with white women. But this wasn't done blindingly because of maybe colonial mentality. It was actually their idea of disturbing the ruler versus ruled relationship, because it was always seen as the ruler is white and the ruled will always be black or Asian. And by having mixed race children, it was their way of being like, no, like we don't want to sit in these comfortable categories anymore. And the London Borough of Tower Hamlets in particular was not happy about this. They often spoke of their disgust, and they say how disgusted they were at this. So we start to see a lot of brown and black faces come into white England, but this led to a huge amount of racial tension. Often people say, because of their self-pride and their willingness to not integrate, an argument which is still used today against immigrants. And it was a global thing. In the 1919 race riots, there was also the Chicago 1919 race riots too. They spread all across the countries, from London up the north, they were everywhere. And this is an image of not the 1919 race riots. And we can kind of see parallels at the moment with what we see with the EDL, what we see with UKIP. Their rhetoric against immigration is very similar to the rhetoric used in these 1919 race riots. For example, there was collective violence at the housing shortages. What do we see when we see UKIP? They're saying there aren't enough houses. Unemployment, once again, we see, oh, there aren't enough jobs, is immigrants taking them. It was these same ideas that were placed and what caused such violence. I also wanted to focus on the idea that these people never sat as immigrants, they never sat down and thought, we were going to face prejudice against each other. There was a form of self-organisation, and these are some of the papers that I think are in the next room.
I think that one's in one of the cases.
Yeah, so this is from the Indian Workers' Conference, and you can see how people formed together, particularly the Indian seamen that I was discussing before. They would form together and have conferences and have discussions. Also, this is a letter to the coloured citizens of West London. This was about the killing of a West Indies man who had been brutally murdered, and they basically give points to people in these communities and say to them, you need to organise, organise, organise. And that's something that we are still seeing today.
1959, that's from shortly after the Notting Hill riots.
Yeah. And there's also, I don't know if Marsh particularly took this, but it says, after talk must come action, which is interesting because that's on our posters now. So yeah, there's the idea of self-organisation. Even in the face of the 1919 or 1950, there's always self-organisation within these communities. So here we are in 1946. Once again, we see work shortages in Europe and Britain. And so there was the idea that Polish people come and allowed to settle, and Italian people, but not more black and Asian people. Why? Racism, plain and simple. And the men that had fought for the West Indies had fought for Britain, but by this point, Britain didn't want them. Of course, because it comes back to the fact of we can extract your labour power, we can take you for like economic uses, but the government turned their back from them. And this was the key start to mass immigration. So here we are, 1950 to 1971. Mass immigration continued into the 1950s, and along that, racial violence and prejudice continued. And there's a reason why I've put Enoch Powell here, and why the original image that was on the first slide was an image of a piece of graffiti that said Powell for PM, sorry, and then there was a black man walking in front of it. And it shows the tension that people started to face. And I've put here, there was the dichotomy of their experience, and by that I mean these people were used by the British, and they almost felt like a sense of like pride in Britain for like fighting for them. But now the government was like, no, we don't want you at all, and was now trying to expel them from the country. And therefore, the government began to make it a lot harder for non-white people to move to the UK. So Enoch Powell's very famous Rivers of Blood speech in 1968 could have been seen as a really key moment in the history of immigration. And I thought I'd just read out a little bit that to me seemed like an argument still used today. So they said, they found their wives unable to obtain hospital beds at childbirth, their children unable to obtain school places, their homes and neighbourhoods changed beyond recognition, their plans and prospects for the future defeated. At work, they found that employers hesitated to apply to the immigrant worker the standards of discipline and competence required of a native-born worker. They began to hear, as time went by, more and more voices which told them they were now unwanted. They now learned that a one-way privilege is to be established by the Act of Parliament, a law which cannot and is not intended to operate to protect them or redress their grievances is to be enacted to give to the stranger, the disgruntled and the agent provocateur the power to pillory them for their private actions. I think very clear in this, you can see the othering of the immigrant. The idea that he calls them the stranger, as if these people hadn't ever had a link to Britain before, as if these immigrants just came out of nowhere, when actually their history was entrenched in colonialism, the British East India Company, and slave trades. And you can really see this as a very pinnacle part of immigration history. And it's been argued that a lot of Enoch Powell's speeches had brought this huge movement where people really supported him. And this is I think it's a scan from the National...
That's National Front.
Yeah, this is National Front. And it says, "White youth unite and fight." And this is young people that were joining National Front, and they say it's for national liberation and social justice. Also, this was 1965, so just before Enoch Powell's speech. We see the tension through the Sussex race riots. If you just have a look at the headlines there, you'll have a chance to look at these properly, I think. Let's go to the next room. But it talks about the effect on the health of Great Britain, the effects on crime figures, and there's a warning here, and it says generous repatriation, who pays? These are arguments that we all still see today. But I don't think anyone can say that everyone fully agreed with Enoch Powell. A lot of the material that we had throughout the MRC has a lot of like leftish tones to it, and you can see in a lot of them that they were very unhappy with Enoch Powell. And this is a wanted poster for murder. And there's also, if you look on the far left corner, there's a Southall demonstration against racism. I think that's Hindi. That's right. That's how it's Hindi. This is in the Socialist Worker as well, which is so interesting to think that they were banding together against racism and against Enoch Powell. Also, school children were also against this like anti-racist argument. This was the school kids against
Nazis.
Yeah, school kids against Nazis. And they use the idea of music to form an anti-racism alliance. And here's different artists non-white artists, that it says they were deported. And through using the idea of music, these were young people, and they were forming against this rhetoric that was starting to really explode. Also, idea of self-organisation can still be seen. There was a housing association made, and I kind of looked into this a little bit, and I don't think it was made by an ethnic minority, this housing association, but it's still very interesting. And it's in one of the cases, this piece, how to file a housing complaint. And I thought I'd include this because of how interesting it is, of how smart these people are. Like, no matter how much racial prejudice they felt, no matter what the racial tensions, they'd always kept their pride. It also reminded me of Malcolm X and this idea of always wearing a suit to appear smart. And if any of you read his autobiography, like, he talks about always wearing a watch because it shows some kind of like self-pride. So here we are in the 70s now. So by this point, immigration was becoming restricted. Housing, the racial tensions was getting massive. There was riots, so restrictions on immigration. And there was a significant immigration from African Asians, and this could be seen because of the expulsion of African Asian people from Africa. So within 2 months, 28,000 African Asians have moved to the UK. There's a huge amount of immigration, especially in a time where there's so much racial tension. And the government now began to open its eyes to racial discrimination, even after centuries of it. And they formed the Commission for Racial Equality. And you began to see Black and Asian faces once again take higher places in society. So for example, this was the year that Viv Anderson, a Black footballer, won for 30 caps. So I guess you could argue that racial equality was now becoming on the agenda for Britain. But I think the further we go into the history of immigration, we'll see it's not completely true. So about the African Asian people, this is a petition that started in Coventry. If you see on the side here, it says People's Protest Against the Influx of Ugandan Asians. And this was a petition that was signed by residents of Coventry. Was it 300?
Well, that particular one is a workplace one,
yeah.
So it's people who are working for Rolls-Royce in Coventry. So it's a petition around the workplace, and a proportion of people there put their signatures down on it. And it wasn't just Rolls-Royce that did this, various different organisations and workplaces in Coventry and presumably elsewhere did the same thing. We've got several examples of these. This was sent to the local MP.
And if you, once you can actually have a look at this physically, if you read the letter, it's quite interesting. This was from a resident in Tyre Hill. Some of you might be living in Tyre Hill right now. And the letter says, the government has announced that it will take responsibility for the unfortunate Ugandan Asians. This will mean overloading an already overloaded education system, creation of an even bigger housing problem. I just wanted to show how these arguments have always been used in history and they're still used today.
Sorry, question. What did you say? It's the Rolls-Royce company?
Yeah.
Like the car company?
Yeah. The parts of Rolls-Royce used to be in Coventry. Coventry is a big centre for the motor industry, and Rolls-Royce was one of the firms that had part of their factories there.
Okay. And were these people working for Rolls-Royce, or they were the ones who were? Okay.
And I've also been reading a book called Small Accidents, and this was a child's experience moving from being an Asian Ugandan moving into Britain during this huge mass of immigration. And they talk about going into school, and this was like an account of their first day at school. And they say the atmosphere in the room was cheerfully noisy, and only a few of the students were distracted by my appearance. And fights usually cropped up because of my colour prejudice or because the bullies took advantage of my physical weakness. What really struck me about this was the last part, and again the self-pride and the we were not going to cower under the face of racism. He says, I was and still am proud of my skin colour and respected by existence, which aggravated things even more at the time. I think that's really telling. Also linked to education was the, I think it's called Teachers Association?
It's with the teachers' unions.
Yeah. And they have a pamphlet that I think as well you can see later on. And they started to have a multicultural society, and they thought that it had to be an educational response to this. And I think there's also a similar pamphlet in one of the cabinets. So I also want to speak about, at this point in the 70s, there's a huge amount of strikes and trade unions. And I wanted to speak about particular the movement called Strikes and SARIS. And these women, they were women that had been in Southall and they were working for, I think it was a film printing company, and they went on strike. And they were the first ethnic minority women to go on strike, and they were immigrants too. And they had a huge amount of support from the labour movement, which was shocking because at other points, people part of the trade union movement were very openly racist, but they still continued. So I thought that was really interesting. Our immigrant women, they would not back down in the face of exploitative bosses. And I also found it particularly interesting because they said that beyond race, and they expected solidarity from the white workers too. And I thought it was so interesting because I've just been looking at riots and the amount of racial tension in this country and the amount of like systematic prejudice that they faced. And these women still had kind of faith in their white comrades, essentially. And I thought that was really interesting. So here we are in the 1980s. There were stricter controls on entry into the UK for immigrants, and this kind of created a conflicting message because the state apparently wanted to protect ethnic minorities' rights. We saw before legislation started to pass, like the Race Equality Commission, but work permits were actually harder to obtain, and therefore immigration for a period turned white. And by that I mean white immigrants from Australia, they found it much easier to move in because they already had the kind of skills that the UK wanted. But because manufacturing had declined by this point, the other immigrants of colour, for example, they couldn't kind of break into this as they couldn't find work permits for manufacturing because manufacturing by this point started to decline. And a huge factor in this was the 1981 race riots in Brixton. They are hugely significant to the history of immigration, especially because the people involved in it, they were second generation immigrant. And here's a picture of the Brixton race riots. When I googled this, some of the pictures were very, very gruesome, so I don't want to include like an incredibly graphic picture. But the Brixton race riots took part for 3 days in April 1981, and young men began to fight against police, particularly black and Asian young men began to fight against the police. They were angry at the idea of stop and search. Stop and search, it was even happening in the 80s, and we are still discussing stop and search now and the implications of it. And it created such a tension with the police that they started to break down shops, started to ruin property, and £7.5 million worth of damage was caused. What's interesting, these people are second generation immigrants. Their parents may have been the Ugandan Indians that had moved here through expulsion of their own country. And they argued that they were rioting because of the superficial nature of equality. So we saw that immigration had created these huge racial tensions, and by maybe having an Asian MP or a black footballer, that is equality. But these young people felt that wasn't equality. And this is when the apparent experimentation of multiculturalism began. This is from Brixton News Sheet, and it's about the Brixton uprising. What's really interesting is that there's ideas of imperialism here, ideas of racism, and even police alpha of Brixton, which is incredibly interesting because this is so relevant to what we're talking about now. I know that the Warwick Anti-Racism Society has lots of talks on the idea of stop and search, and it's still something that affects young people of colour all the time. And this was also really interesting, which was in one of the cabinets over there. It says the police are to blame and not the people of Brixton. So once again, these tensions with the police caused by this history of immigration and never really ironing out the tensions, the racial tensions. So here we are in 1987 to 2002. By 1987, 4 non-white politicians were elected at the general election. There was more black and brown faces, and this was apparently a step towards representation. But I don't really think it was representation. Death of Stephen Lawrence happened in 1993 in a racially motivated attack, and this led to new legislation, but it took someone's death to create some new legislation regarding racial equality. There was a continuation of racial tensions, and there was a new wave of immigration due to asylum seeker applications. We also saw in 2002 the rise of the BNP, with the BNP obtaining 3 seats. So where are we now with immigration? I think all of us know about UKIP. I put these posters up because I thought it was so interesting how even the literature, like in the 50s, like people like the residents of Coventry talking about housing, talking about jobs, we're still seeing the same rhetoric now. So this one says 26 million people in Europe are looking for work, and whose jobs are they after? And then it says here, EU policy at work, British workers are hit hard by unlimited cheap labour. And I also included this, I did a piece of research last year on this van that moved around 6 London boroughs, 6 ethnic London boroughs, and was basically telling immigrants, if you're in the UK illegally, go home or face arrest. So I think you can kind of see the history of immigration has never been one of equality, and it's always been very overt. And I really think that this was summed up. This was from 2010. So yeah, that is a very brief history on immigration.